I'm heartened by the support I've received today in Parliament. There have been lots of suggestions from as much appreciated individuals within the Parliament.
Farm buildings, which we've seen police searching on day 2. They've been emptying buckets of rubble from inside the buildings, and they've been using chainsaws in dense undergrowth as well.
To start an investigation and say, we're not looking at the parents, means that you aren't actually doing a proper investigation, because you start at ground zero when you do a proper investigation or a proper review. You start with the evidence. You go back to the crime scene. You go back to day 1.
This was a crime that touched the heart of everyone in the country, and everyone would like to see it resolved. So I hope Scotland Yard continue with their work, and I wish them success.
On the evening of May 3rd, 2007, in the small resort town of Praia da Luz, Portugal, families had drifted toward their nightly routines. Children were tucked into beds, and parents lingered over dinner. But inside apartment 5A of the Ocean Club, a moment occurred that would fracture lives and captivate the world. 3-year-old Madeleine McCann was gone. A window stood ajar, her soft toys still in the bed, but the little girl was nowhere to be found. What should have been an ordinary holiday night turned into the beginning of one of the most infamous mysteries of our time. In the hours that followed, chaos unfolded. The apartment was never properly sealed. Neighbors, staff, and even friends moved in and out. Precious evidence disappeared into the noise of confusion. The Portuguese police, overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight, wavered in their early response, and in those critical first days, doubt crept in. Were investigators chasing the truth or constructing a narrative that would shape everything to come? As the investigation deepened, suspicion shifted like sand. At first, all eyes turned to strangers. Witnesses reported seeing men carrying a child near the resort. Sketches were drawn, and theories of abduction swirled. Yet soon, the very parents who pleaded for their daughter's safe return found themselves under the harsh glare of accusation. In September 2007, Kate and Gerry McCann were declared official suspects. Portuguese investigators argued that Madeleine had died in the apartment and her parents had covered it up. It was a shocking turn that split public opinion and strained international relations. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world. Came another shift. British authorities entered the case with a powerful presence. Operation Grange, a review launched in 2011, framed the disappearance as a criminal act by a stranger, a planned abduction, or a burglary gone wrong. From that moment, the abduction theory became the dominant lens, reinforced by political figures and amplified by a relentless media campaign. And here lies the haunting question. Why was so much energy poured into that single line of inquiry when other possibilities remained open? Was it the weight of political pressure, the deep ties between the McCanns and figures of influence back home? Or was it the simple narrative, an innocent child stolen from her bed, that proved too powerful to resist? The stakes only grew higher as the years passed. International detectives, millions in funding, suspects identified and then dismissed. German authorities named Christian Brueckner as a prime suspect in 2020, but to this day, no charges have been brought. Each supposed breakthrough dissolved into uncertainty. Each press conference reignited old wounds, but offered no closure. Meanwhile, the media storm became its own kind of trial. Madeleine's image transformed into a global icon of innocence. Her distinctive eye mark broadcast on screens from London to Los Angeles. Her parents became both advocates and targets, sacralized one moment, vilified the next. They met with popes, prime ministers, and presidents, leveraging every platform to keep her name alive. Yet this media machine also fueled resentment. particularly among Portuguese authorities, who bristled at the suggestion that they were incompetent or corrupt. The search for Madeleine became entangled in questions of national pride, media exploitation, and political influence. 17 years later, we are left with a chilling paradox. We know more about the failures, the controversies, and the politics surrounding the case than we do about what actually happened to Madeleine. Her absence lingers not only as a family's private grief, but as a reminder of how justice can bend under pressure. The question that still hangs in the air is not simply what happened to Madeleine McCann. It is whose story were we really told? Was it the story of a child's abduction, or the story of institutions, governments, and media protecting their own? And in the silence of that question lies the most unsettling truth of all. The McCann family, along with 7 close friends, later dubbed the Tapas 9, had come seeking rest, sun, and companionship. The group included doctors, parents, and their children, bound together by years of friendship and trust. The Ocean Club was their chosen sanctuary. Whitewashed apartments, pools glistening under the Algarve sun, and a small tapas restaurant just a short stroll away. But what seemed idyllic by day would soon reveal cracks by night. The parents developed a nightly rhythm, one they defended as reasonable and safe. Each evening, the adults gathered at the tapas bar, while their 9 children, including Madeleine and her younger twin siblings, were left sleeping in the unlocked apartments. Instead of hiring the resort's available creche service, the group devised what they called a checking system, rotating turns to look in on the children every half hour. For the McCanns, it was a compromise between enjoying their holiday and fulfilling parental duties. Gerry's sister would later insist this was no act of neglect, but rather the decision of careful, attentive parents. Yet for many onlookers, especially once tragedy struck, the optics told another story. Madeleine's grandmother herself admitted she was astonished that her daughter and friends believed it was safe to leave their children alone at all. This tension between protection and risk would soon become one of the most heavily scrutinized elements of the case. To the McCanns, their actions reflected trust in the resort's safety and their own diligence. To critics, however, it was a decision no ordinary family could defend. One British woman famously remarked that if any other working-class couple had left their children in such a way, they would have been prosecuted and stripped of parental rights. The accusation was not just of negligence, it was of privilege, of a double standard that sheltered the McCanns from consequences. When the alarm was raised at 10 p.m. on May 3rd, chaos and confusion overtook the Ocean Club. Kate McCann claimed she found the bedroom window open, the shutter raised, and her daughter's bed empty. The curtains, which had been closed, just swung open into the room and revealed that the shutter was all the way up and the window being pushed right across. Her cry, "They've taken her," raced across the resort and into headlines worldwide. But even in those first moments, doubt began to creep in. Did the checking system really occur as described? Some witnesses insisted it had. Others, including a private investigator later embedded at the resort, claimed restaurant staff told him, "Nobody ever left the table that night," and so from the very beginning, a shadow of contradiction stretched over the narrative. Were the McCanns and their friends responsibly balancing leisure with care, or had their story of half-hourly checks been shaped after the fact, an alibi forged to cover the discomfort of leaving children alone? The broader public split sharply. Compassion and outrage mingled uneasily. On one hand, the image of 2 desperate parents begging for their daughter's return evoked global sympathy. On the other, the knowledge that 9 young children had been left alone in unlocked apartments at night sparked condemnation. The fact that Kate and Gerry McCann were never prosecuted for neglect added fuel to that anger. Portuguese Minister Rui Pereira would later admit they were spared charges out of compassion and because authorities clung to a mistaken belief that leaving children unattended was a cultural norm among the British. This early leniency, intended perhaps as mercy, would later come to haunt the case. It fed suspicions of favoritism, of political and cultural bias, shielding the McCanns from accountability. Former Inspector Moita Flores argued bluntly that if the family had been Portuguese, charges of abandonment would have been inevitable. That one decision not to prosecute set the stage for years of bitterness, mistrust, and controversy that still echo today. The night Madeleine vanished, 9 adults trusted a fragile system of checks, one that left open windows, unlocked doors, and unmonitored gaps. And in that fragile space, a child disappeared. Whether through abduction, accident, or something darker, the fact remains. What should have been a safe haven was compromised by choices that would be scrutinized forever. It is here, in this uneasy blend of compassion and criticism, of family grief and public judgment, that the story of Madeleine McCann truly begins. In the aftermath of Madeleine's disappearance, public anger turned toward a painful question. Had the McCanns and their friends been guilty of criminal neglect? On paper, the circumstances were stark. 9 children left alone across several apartments, doors unlocked, their parents seated at a restaurant just far enough away to prevent immediate response. Under the letter of Portuguese law, the definition of neglect seemed clear, yet no prosecution ever came. Former Portuguese Interior Minister Rui Pereira would later reveal the decision had been guided less by law and more by compassion. He admitted officials considered the case with a kind of indulgence, assuming that leaving children unattended might be a cultural habit among British families on holiday. This interpretation, however, was met with fierce criticism. Many argued that by sparing the McCanns legal scrutiny, investigators weakened their own credibility and reinforced perceptions of bias. If another Portuguese family had done the same, critics insisted, they would have been charged without hesitation. The leniency left a lingering shadow. What if the neglect narrative itself was incomplete, or worse, a deliberate cover? Some have suggested that the group's story about half-hourly checks served as a fragile alibi, constructed to conceal the possibility that something else had gone terribly wrong inside apartment 5A. Did Madeleine truly vanish during a window of vulnerability? Or had the timeline been shaped to protect reputations and divert suspicion? These doubts have persisted, fueling endless speculation. The inconsistencies became sharper when the abduction theory was scrutinized. At first, the story centered on a window in the children's bedroom. Kate McCann reported that the shutter had been raised and the window opened, pointing toward an intruder's entry and exit. I knew straight away she didn't been taken, her raw words reveal. But forensic teams found no sign of forced entry, no foreign fingerprints, and only Kate's own prints on the glass. The claim of a break-in began to falter under examination. Attention then shifted to another version, that an intruder had slipped through the sliding patio doors, left unlocked by the McCanns for convenience as they moved back and forth from the restaurant. This explanation required no forced entry, no dramatic tampering, just the presence of opportunity. Yet even this scenario raised troubling questions. Why take Madeleine, the eldest child, when her younger siblings lay nearby, easier to carry and less likely to resist? Why arrange her bedclothes neatly, leaving the room strangely undisturbed? Adding to the confusion were the varying witness accounts. Jane Tanner, one of the friends dining that night, claimed she saw a man carrying a child in pajamas near the apartment at around 9:15 p.m. But her sighting was never corroborated by others who should have been in a position to see the same figure. Meanwhile, an Irish family later reported seeing another man carrying a sleeping child toward the beach around 10 p.m., a sighting that became known as the Smithman account. Each version painted a different picture, none of them aligning seamlessly. Compounding matters further, resort staff later told a private investigator that none of the adults actually left the tapas table to conduct the checks they described. Was this a simple lapse in memory, or proof that the system of half-hour visits never existed? The smallest details, which should have anchored the truth, instead dissolved into contradiction. For the Portuguese police, these inconsistencies reinforced a darker hypothesis: that Madeleine had died in the apartment, and her disappearance was staged to look like an abduction. For the British investigators who later took over, it was stranger abduction that seemed the most plausible. Between these two opposing narratives stretched a chasm of mistrust, cultural conflict, and political pressure. And through it all, the truth of what happened to a 3-year-old girl slipped further into uncertainty. Nearly 2 decades on, the question remains as haunting as the night it began. Was Madeleine's disappearance the result of a cold-blooded abductor seizing his moment, or a tragedy concealed beneath layers of denial and narrative control? The answer lies buried in those first crucial hours, in the conflicting stories told by friends and family, and in the silence of a seaside apartment where a child was last seen alive. From the very first hours after Madeleine McCann's disappearance, this was never just a local investigation. It was never simply a case for the small police force in Praia da Luz. The involvement of politics at the highest level transformed what should have been a straightforward missing child inquiry into a geopolitical flashpoint. Within hours of Kate McCann's anguished cry that her daughter was gone, the British ambassador to Portugal, John Buck, arrived at the scene. His presence so early was striking. Ambassadors do not usually appear at local police stations when tourists fall victim to crime, but this was no ordinary family. These were respected doctors with ties to the British establishment, and their story was about to command international attention. Soon after, Gerry McCann received personal phone calls from Gordon Brown, then Chancellor of the Exchequer and future Prime Minister. Brown reassured the family that Britain would support them at the highest level. That reassurance turned into action. When the McCanns pressed for Portuguese police to release details of a man seen carrying a child the night Madeleine vanished, it was Gordon Brown who intervened. Through diplomatic pressure, secrecy laws that normally bound Portuguese investigations were bent. Witness descriptions that had been kept hidden were suddenly published, changing the course of public discussion. And this was only the beginning. Over the years, no fewer than 4 British prime ministers would lend their support to the McCann family, a level of political involvement unparalleled in any other missing child case. The effect was powerful, but controversial. For some, it was proof of compassion, a government standing beside grieving parents. For others, it was evidence of extraordinary favoritism, raising the question of why one family's tragedy commanded the levers of state, while countless others did not. As the months unfolded, suspicions of bias grew sharper. Even as Kate and Gerry were still under the status of arguidos, formal suspects in Portugal, Gerry McCann was invited to attend the Police Bravery Awards in London. There, in full view of the public and media, he received thunderous applause from senior officers. To critics, the message was clear. British institutions had chosen their side. Far from being scrutinized like other suspects, the McCanns were elevated, defended, and embraced. Yet while Britain rallied behind the couple, the Portuguese investigators pursued their own course. Operation Task, led by Inspector Gonçalo Amaral, began as a methodical attempt to piece together events from May 3, 2007. Amaral was an experienced officer familiar with complex cases, but from the outset, he faced mounting hostility. British commentators derided the local police as incompetent, labeling them bungling and unfit for such a sensitive investigation. The McCann's friends and allies amplified this image. Dr. Jill Rennick, a family acquaintance, even called into live television to criticize the Portuguese force. What seemed like spontaneous outrage took on a more troubling dimension when it was later revealed that Rennick's brother was the next-door neighbor of Gordon Brown. This coincidence only deepens suspicions of an inside track between the McCanns, their political defenders, and the machinery of British influence. It painted a picture of investigators under siege, not only from media scrutiny, but from pressure at the very highest levels of foreign government. As Amaral's team pressed forward, they began to suspect contradictions in the McCann's account. Cadaver dogs alerted to the scent of death in the family's apartment and rental car. DNA traces were analyzed, though results remained inconclusive. Amaral came to believe the evidence pointed not to abduction, but to an accidental death covered up and reframed as kidnapping. It was a theory that enraged the McCanns and horrified their supporters, but one he pursued with determination. The clash between the two narratives, one of abduction supported by British authorities and one of concealment favored by Portuguese investigators, set the stage for a storm of diplomatic tension. Media outlets in the UK portrayed Amaral as reckless, even malicious. British tabloids launched headlines that undermined the credibility of Portuguese police. At the same time, leaks from within Portugal painted the McCanns as uncooperative, even manipulative. Trust between the two forces collapsed, and the search for Madeleine became entangled in a bitter feud over national pride, politics, and control. By late 2007, Amaral himself would be forced out, dismissed after openly criticizing the British police for focusing only on leads that aligned with the McCann's version of events. His removal was celebrated by the couple's allies, but it deepened divisions. To Amaral, it was proof that political interference had trumped the independence of an investigation. To his defenders, it was an injustice against a man who had dared to question the powerful. This was the backdrop in which the Madeleine McCann case shifted from a police inquiry to a political and media battleground. What should have been a singular mission, the search for a missing child, was consumed by disputes over influence, privilege, and truth itself. In defending their work, the Portuguese investigators pointed out that they had already granted the McCanns privileges never afforded to other suspects. When Kate was questioned for hours, Gerry was allowed to sit by her side, an unprecedented concession in Portuguese legal practice. Updates from the investigation, normally kept strictly confidential, were at times relayed to the couple's representatives, bending the rules of secrecy that govern such cases. And yet, despite these accommodations, Kate was discovered sending text messages during her interrogation, a breach that raised eyebrows among officers who wondered how fully the McCanns respected the process meant to find their child. Still, public opinion in Britain painted the Portuguese police as cruel and obstructive. The McCanns' spokesperson amplified that view, stressing the family's suffering while dismissing local investigators as inept. For Portuguese authorities, it felt as if they were trapped in a contest they could not win. To show compassion was to risk undermining their case. To enforce procedure was to be branded heartless. The clash reached its breaking point when Gonçalo Amaral spoke to the press. Frustrated, he accused the British police of acting only on leads that suited the McCanns, ignoring alternative scenarios that placed the family under suspicion. Within days, Amaral was removed from his post. The decision, presented as a disciplinary measure, was seen by his supporters as proof of foreign pressure. Amaral himself later claimed that Gordon Brown knew of his dismissal before he did. Whether true or not, the allegation underscored just how politically entangled the case had become. Behind closed doors, tensions were equally raw. A leaked Home Office report would later reveal that the McCann's had not only clashed with Portuguese officers, but also with their own British counterparts. They had gathered information through private investigators, yet refused to share all of it with official detectives. The document described a turbulent relationship with both Portuguese and UK law enforcement, and admitted openly that trust between all parties had collapsed. The case had ceased to be a unified search for a missing child and had become a fractured struggle over narrative control and credibility. Then in 2008, Amaral struck back, not with an investigation, but with a book, Maddie, The Truth of the Lie. He laid out his theory that Madeleine had died in the apartment and that her parents had staged an abduction to cover it up. The book was blunt, controversial, and devastating in its implications. To the McCann's, it was a direct attack on their integrity, a reckless act that sabotaged the search for their daughter. They sued Amaral for libel, winning an initial judgment that banned the book and awarded them damages. But the tide soon turned. Portuguese courts overturned the ruling, concluding that Amaral's account, however disturbing, fell within his right to free expression. Years of appeals followed, culminating in a final ruling by the European Court of Human Rights in 2022. The court sided with Amaral, declaring that his book represented a legitimate contribution to public debate based on information drawn from the actual investigation. For the McCann's, the decision was crushing. They had fought for over a decade to silence a narrative that painted them as complicit in their daughter's disappearance. Yet the highest court in Europe had ruled otherwise. Amaral, though no longer a police officer, emerged vindicated. And in a twist that seemed almost cinematic, reports surfaced that officers within London's Metropolitan Police had quietly donated to Amaral's legal defence fund, a gesture of solidarity with a man they felt had been unfairly vilified. This extraordinary turn of events crystallized the bitterness of the Madeleine McCann case. What began as a desperate search for a missing child had evolved into a protracted battle between two police forces, two nations, and two competing versions of truth. The stakes were no longer only about Madeleine. They were about credibility, influence, and legacy. Nearly 2 decades later, the scars remain. The Portuguese investigation is remembered by some as fatally flawed, by others as unfairly undermined. The British role is celebrated by supporters as compassionate and derided by critics as politically compromised. And through it all, Madeleine herself remains missing, a child whose fate has been overshadowed by the storm that followed her disappearance. By 2008, the silence around Madeleine's disappearance was pierced by something extraordinary. Thousands of pages from the Portuguese police investigation, statements, forensic reports, and witness interviews were released online. For the first time, the world could sift through the raw material of the case. What emerged was not a tidy tale of abduction, but a maze of contradictions, missteps, and troubling signs that cut deeper than anyone had expected. Among those who studied the files was American profiler Pat Brown. Her conclusion was unsettling. There was no evidence of abduction. Brown argued that the case files showed legitimate grounds to view the McCanns as suspects. Cadaver dogs had alerted inside the family's apartment and rental car. DNA samples were inconclusive, but raised suspicion. Witness accounts of the so-called checking system at the tapas bar faltered under scrutiny. To Brown, The abduction narrative looked less like fact and more like a shield against uncomfortable possibilities. And yet in Britain, the narrative of abduction was fiercely protected. Media outlets portrayed the McCanns as victims of a foreign system, persecuted parents rather than potential suspects. But if the files cast doubt, why did Britain double down on the abduction theory? The answer lies in the alliance between politics and the press. At the center of this alliance stood Rebekah Brooks, then chief executive of News International, Rupert Murdoch's media empire. A longtime friend of the McCanns, Brooks became a driving force in reshaping public pressure. At the couple's request, she lobbied Prime Minister David Cameron directly, pressing him to fund a new review of the case. What followed was unprecedented. Just one day after Kate McCann's book was serialized in The Sun, Cameron announced that Scotland Yard would conduct a full review of the Portuguese investigation. The timing was no coincidence. Behind the scenes, Brooks had reportedly warned Cameron that his Home Secretary, Theresa May, would face damaging headlines if he refused. Whether it was persuasion or coercion, the effect was clear. Operation Grange was born, not as a neutral review, but under the weight of political and media pressure. The Sun amplified the push with a relentless campaign urging readers to stand with the McCanns, portraying the Portuguese police as bungling and indifferent. Headlines spoke of hope, of renewed efforts, of the need for justice. But critics saw something different. An investigation shaped not by evidence, but by influence. A case that had already been politically charged in Portugal was now remade under British authority, backed by millions in taxpayer funds and the full weight of Fleet Street's most powerful tabloids. This was the moment the McCann case ceased to be only about a missing child. It became a story about power, how political will, media pressure, and family influence could combine to reframe an entire investigation. And in that reframing, Operation Grange took its first steps with its true purpose already under scrutiny. On paper, Operation Grange was built as an investigative review. Scotland Yard framed its mission as a neutral reassessment of what the Portuguese police had done and what might have been overlooked. The language was careful, bureaucratic, almost clinical. It suggested impartiality, as though detectives would spread out every file on a table and follow wherever the evidence led. But almost immediately, the framing revealed itself as anything but neutral. The Met entered the case on the assumption that Madeleine had been abducted and that her parents were not suspects. A detective famously said they had a healthy interest in young white female children who are being attacked whilst they're in their beds on their holiday. For seasoned investigators, this was a startling breach of protocol. A proper investigation begins with all possibilities open, every witness, every family member, every potential suspect examined without prejudice. To close off avenues from the outset is to risk shaping the outcome before the first interview is even conducted. Critics saw Operation Grange not as an objective review, but as a political project designed to restore faith in the McCanns, to remove once and for all the cloud of suspicion that had lingered since they were declared arguidos in Portugal. Pat Brown, the American profiler, called it a charade, a costly exercise that generated headlines but no new evidence. And indeed, despite nearly 2 decades of effort, tens of millions of pounds, and thousands of investigative hours, the operation has produced no definitive answers. The stakes, however, went beyond forensics. For the McCanns, Operation Grange provided something invaluable, a seal of official endorsement. If Scotland Yard declared this an abduction case, then the parents could re-enter public life not as suspects but as campaigners. They could harness their grief not only as a private burden, but but as a public mission. And so, Kate and Gerry McCann stepped into roles that extended far beyond the search for their daughter. Gerry became an advocate for press regulation, joining the movement hacked off in the wake of Britain's tabloid scandals. He argued for the protection of families like his own, whose personal lives had been torn apart by invasive reporting. Kate, meanwhile, became an ambassador for the charity Missing People, lending her voice to campaigns on behalf of other families enduring the agony of disappearance. To supporters, these roles symbolized resilience, a couple who transformed their suffering into advocacy. To critics, they raised uneasy questions. Could parents once named as suspects truly serve as neutral champions in these causes? Or did their elevated status reflect the same political and media shield that had protected them since the beginning? By the mid-2010s, Operation Grange had spent staggering sums, drawn global headlines, and reshaped the McCann's public image. Yet it had not brought Madeleine home, nor resolved the contradictions at the heart of the case. What it had accomplished was something more intangible. It had rebranded the narrative from suspicion to sympathy, from accused to advocates. The McCann's journey through Operation Grange illustrated how an investigation can serve purposes far beyond solving a crime. And it is here, between the stated goals and the hidden implications, that the story of Operation Grange takes its most unsettling turn. Secrecy, influence, and missing pieces. That is the undercurrent running through Operation Grange, a review that was supposed to shine light but instead raised fresh doubts. To understand how, we need to examine the decisions, conflicts, and blind spots that shaped the investigation from the very beginning. From the outside, Scotland Yard's involvement promised expertise and impartiality. Yet even at the top, questions of bias seeped through. Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, the man overseeing Operation Grange, had not been a detached figure in the Madeleine case. Years earlier, he had participated in fundraising efforts for the Find Madeleine Fund, selling balloons to support what was in reality not a registered charity, but a limited company. What might have looked like a gesture of solidarity became in hindsight a troubling sign. How could the chief guardian of impartiality preside over an inquiry when he had already shown public support for one side of the case? This was not just a matter of optics. In investigations of this magnitude, perception is as vital as procedure. If the figure at the top is seen as partial, then every decision beneath him risks the same accusation. Instead of cutting through controversy, Operation Grange entered the stage with a shadow already hanging over it. But the greater problem came from the way the investigation was designed. Retired Detective Collins Sutton, one of the UK's most experienced homicide investigators, revealed he had been quietly warned against taking the job of leading Operation Grange. He would not be allowed to go where he wanted. In other words, the boundaries had already been drawn. The McCanns were not to be investigated. This was later confirmed in public. Detective Chief Inspector Andy Redwood, the face of Operation Grange, stated bluntly, "Neither the parents nor any of the group that were with them are persons of interest or suspects." That statement, delivered at the start, did more than reassure the McCanns. It shackled the investigation itself. American profiler Pat Brown was among the loudest critics. She argued that a proper investigation must begin from ground zero, without sacred cows or protected parties. Instead, Operation Grange started not with questions, but with conclusions. And every police officer knows, once you decide what you cannot look at, you risk twisting the evidence to fit the narrative you've already chosen. The impact was immediate. Leads that pointed toward inconsistencies in the McCann's own timeline were downplayed. Forensic controversies, like cadaver dog alerts in the family's apartment and rental car, were brushed aside. The Portuguese case files, which had once treated the parents as suspects, were now reinterpreted under the assumption of their innocence, In effect, the review was not an inquiry into what happened to Madeleine, but an effort to reinforce one version of events. What happens when detectives disagree, not just with evidence, but with each other. Inside Britain's law enforcement community, Operation Grange became a fracture line. Accounts have surfaced of private online groups where serving officers discussed the case with frustration and disbelief. They criticized what they saw as bias and questioned why the review was designed to protect certain individuals from scrutiny. But in one telling episode, when a discussion veered too close to questioning the McCanns, a senior officer allegedly threatened to report participants for misconduct. The message was unmistakable. Even inside police circles, to doubt the official line was dangerous. This culture of silence only deepened suspicions. Was Scotland Yard truly free to investigate, or was it bound by political and institutional pressure from the start? Critics like Bert Steller, who spent years piecing together inconsistencies, believed Grange was hobbled, deliberately designed to look thorough while avoiding its most explosive possibility, that Madeleine's disappearance involved those closest to her. The division was stark. On one side, the public face of the Met Police presenting a streamlined story of abduction, fresh leads, and taxpayer-funded pursuit of hope. On the other, a quieter undercurrent of officers, analysts, and commentators who insisted that the real questions were being ignored. By the time Operation Grange passed its 10th year, with millions spent and no arrests made, these fractures were no longer whispers, they were part of the open debate. Had the investigation ever truly sought the truth, or was it always about protecting reputations? And that is where the deeper controversies begin to unfold, where disputed witness accounts, discarded evidence, and staggering costs collide to tell a story of an inquiry that may have been built as much on politics as on policing. If Operation Grange was meant to reset the case, it did so by discarding one of its earliest pillars, the sketch drawn from Jane Tanner's account. A friend of the McCanns, who claimed she saw a man carrying a child near the apartment. Around 9:15 p.m., the sketch was quietly set aside. For years, that image had dominated headlines, presented as the face of a possible abductor. But as Grange dug in, the Tanner sighting was ruled far less credible. Detectives concluded she had likely seen another holidaymaker, a father returning from the resort creche with his child. Instead, attention shifted to another account, one that had been sitting in the shadows, the Smith family sighting. At around 10 p.m., on the night Madeleine vanished, an Irish family crossing a narrow street in Praia da Luz reported seeing a man carrying a young girl, barefoot and dressed in light-colored pajamas. The child appeared motionless, as though asleep. The location was less than 300 meters from the Ocean Club, and the man was walking toward the beach. For years, the Smiths' account had received little attention, but their testimony carried haunting weight. Martin Smith, the family's patriarch, later stated he was 60 to 80% sure. The man resembled Gerry McCann himself. That claim, explosive in its implications, was quickly diluted in the press. Reports surfaced, suggesting Smith had retracted his view. Yet investigative journalist Gemma O'Doherty later confirmed he had not. The contradiction lingered like smoke, never solid enough to become fire, but never vanishing completely. Why, critics asked, were the Smith e-fits, images drawn from the family's descriptions, suppressed for 5 years after being created by private investigators hired by the McCanns? Only in 2013, during a BBC Crime Watch appeal, were they revealed as central to the investigation. By then, the trail was cold, the significance diluted. For skeptics, the delay looked less like oversight and more like deliberate suppression. After learning about the institutional flaws, the conflicting testimonies, and the immense political and financial resources poured into this single case, How has your view of the investigation changed? Does the idea of a ground zero approach, which would re-examine every aspect, including the McCann's, seem like a necessary step for justice? And if so, what responsibility do you feel the public now has to demand such an inquiry?